the webinar from HKA today, which will be looking at assessment of major international variations, delays, disruption and acceleration claims. And it's also going to draw some information from a thought leadership paper which HKA issues each year, and we'll be making reference to the 2019 paper, which looked at causes of global claims. Now, today's two speakers, I'm David Price, a partner in HKA, and I've also got with me Charles Wilson-Croft. So just very briefly, a little bit of background on both of us. Firstly, myself, chartered QA, chartered arbitrator, and also a barrister. I've been working in the industry for 42 years and 34 years with HKA and its previous guisers as Hill International and Knowles. My work internationally started in 1991 when we opened up our first forays into the overseas markets in Europe, and generally worked around the world ever since, mainly for contractors, but occasionally for employers. And my main areas of expertise and claims are on buildings, civils, probably most of the time on oil and gas, power, and also a bit of offshore marine and shipbuilding. I'm turning to my colleague today, also speaking, is Charles Wilson-Croft, who's also a partner in HKA and also equally very experienced and qualified as a civil engineer, member of the Institute of Civil Engineers and a member of the Institute of Arbitrators. He has a BEng in Civil Engineering, MSc in Construction Law and Arbitration. He's been with the company now 11 years, worked very closely with me over the years, particularly in offshore infrastructure and the energy markets, and worked around the world, done a lot of in-house training, and his main areas are infrastructure, marine engineering, energy, oil, both onshore and offshore. Just introducing, just a very brief kind of overview of the webinar today, what we're going to be looking at. We're going to examine the key commercial issues that face you as contractors and employers in the international construction market. And it's in relation to variations, which you'll all be familiar with, and claims for delay, disruption, and acceleration. And we're overlaying that, quite interesting, with an actual in-depth research results from the CRUX report, which I referred to earlier. It's something that we issue each year, provides the industry and our clients with a valuable insight into what are the reasons behind claims and disputes arising. And just some brief numbers, the 2019 CRUX report that we're going to be focusing on today is based on the analysis of some 4,105 causes of dispute on 700 projects in 72 countries that we have worked on between 2017 January and the end of August 2019. And those 700 projects had a combined capital expenditure in excess of $1.2 trillion. Now, in compiling this report, which is quite an extensive internal document, for us, we engaged over 400 of our staff in contributing to the report, and each of those that contributed had to have spent more than a month on their respective projects that they were commenting on in terms of what caused the delays, etc. The summaries that came out of this 2019 report, and we'll look at it in more detail later, was that the average number of causes per dispute was 5.8, and that was with an average number of primary causes causing the problem of 3.5 primary causes, and additionally 2.3 on average secondary causes. and the maximum number of causes that we came across on a single project out of those 700 projects was 30 causes. Obviously not a project any of us would have liked being involved with on site. Now, I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Charles, who will take you through the next phase of the webinar, and I'll come back in when we're looking at the CRUX findings in some more detail. So over to Charles.
Just before Charles begins, if that's okay, I'll just go through a couple of housekeeping points. Everybody is on mute. We will do a Q&A session at the end. If people want to ask a question, you just need to press the raise hand button that's in your control panel. The webinar is being recorded, but that doesn't allow any of your login details to be shared in any way, shape or form. If there are a lot of Q&As at the end of the session, and we don't want the session to run over too long, we will collate a document and circulate it to you along with the slides at the end. And this is our first time of using our new webinar platform, so we're hoping that the connections and the technology will be robust this morning, and everything runs smoothly. So thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for the intro,
so
David.
The speakers do that.
Yes, and I'll hand over to Charles, who'll start us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both. Well, good morning, good afternoon to everybody on the call. So thanks for joining us today. As David said, we're going to touch on and talk about some contractual commercial issues facing contractors and indeed employers in pursuing claims and variations and valuing such. Later on, we'll be looking at how the CRUX data deals with that, and we'll be looking at things like prolongation and acceleration. I appreciate there's quite a lot to get through in an hour, so I'm going to crack on. But of course, all of these things that we talk about can be talked about in much greater depth. And if anyone does want to chat afterwards, then please do feel free. So, notice procedures. Well, I'm sure we're all aware about notice procedures nowadays. I mean, frankly, it seems to me, and to be perfectly honest, I can't remember the last time I've seen any kind of construction contract without some form of notification provision included therein. Contracts are more and more becoming, they're evolving from a traditional document that sets out the liabilities and responsibilities of each party to becoming much more proactive, project management focused documents. And we've seen that in the development of the FIDIC contracts. So in the 1999 version, there is the inclusion of a notification period and other prescriptive requirements in respect of pursuing claims. And even further, the genesis has moved on to the 2017 versions, has become much more prescriptive as to how the parties are to manage their claims process, issue notifications, manage programs, and deal with things on a much more proactive manner. I presume we're all aware of clause 20.1 of the FIDIC 1999 suite of contracts, which is a very well trodden set of conditions, which has a 28-day notification period for any event that entitles the contractor to time and or cost under any clause within the or in relation to the contract. The 2017 version, as you may know if you have used it, tries to go a little bit further than that. In my view, it makes it a bit more complex. It gives a bit more leeway to the contractor potentially and allows, well, I'd say in inverted commas, allows late or appears to allow late notification. However, the project manager or the engineer has to notify in response to say that the notification is late. But there's also an ability for the contractor to issue a substantiation or justification for why they're still entitled to a claim. But we're not going to get into the wheres and wherefores of that. What I would say to you is that notifications are prevalent through every form of contracting nowadays, be it shipbuilding contracts, be it insulating contracts, be it onshore construction, be it office blocks, be it energy plants. They all have notification periods, and care should be taken to check every single contract that you use, because very frequently standardized notification periods are amended. So the FIDIC contracts, as we know, is standardized at 28 days, but it's not rare for that to be reduced to 14 days. Maybe I've even seen examples of 5 days less, 3 days for notification periods. So the parties need to be aware of what their responsibilities and obligations are in respect of notices. The about notices is that if the notification clause is properly worded, so it gives a specific ramification if the notification is not given, i.e. the contractor will lose entitlement to time and/or cost, and also gives a definitive timescale for service of that notice, i.e. 28 days under the FIDIC, then certainly in common law jurisdictions and in most civil jurisdictions, the courts will uphold that as being sacrosanct. So parties, if a notification has been issued outside of that period, then the contractor runs a very big risk of losing all entitlement to time and cost in respect of that item. This has been shown in the recent case of Van Ord versus Allseas in 2015, where the judge was absolutely clear in upholding the notification provisions. The notification provisions, as long as they're clearly worded and unambiguous, will be applied. Also, notably in the case of the same year, John versus Gibraltar 2015, whereby although the judge questioned at what point the notification period should commence, so at what point the clock should start ticking, the judge did still come back and say, well, irrespective of that, the timescale still applies and still must be applied by the parties to secure entitlement. So it's really, really incredibly important that the notice provisions under your contracts are understood, and more importantly, even so, complied with. So variations. I won't go into the definition of what a variation is. Different contracts define them in different ways, but I think we're all probably quite attuned to what a variation means under most contracts. And the valuation of variations is supported by the Society of Construction Law, which is also supported by judgments in common law courts, which effectively runs on the basis we call the rules of 1, 2 and 3. So this is where you have a contract that has rates for work, so a remeasurable form of contract or a remeasurable contract where there are rates for certain types of work. The general rule of 1, 2, 3 is that if you have a variation that has work of a similar nature and is carried out in similar conditions to the work foreseen in the contract, then it's suitable and sufficient and correct to apply the contract rates for that varied work. Rule 2 is where you have similar work carried out under the variation, but carried out under different situations or under different conditions. So what do we mean by that? Well, it might be that, let's say, for example, you're excavating material, you're excavating foundations or a basement or whatever the case may be, and you know the ground conditions. There are certain kind of sand with a certain amount of clay dispersed within, boulders of a certain size, and that's fantastic. But the contract you priced on is based on going down 2 meters, whereas you get a variation to say, well, actually, we're going to go down 2 meters, well, 5 meters, or whatever the case may be. Now, the material getting out might still be the same material. So you'd say the work is of a similar character because you're digging out the same kind of stuff and you're moving it the same way and you're disposing of it the same way. But all of a sudden, it's become much deeper, or it's become harder to get to, or you need a different piece of kit that was not foreseen under the contract. So in that situation, the work is a similar character, but it's carried out under different conditions. And in that case, Rule 2 governs that you can take the rate for the similar kind of work in the contract and adjust it accordingly for the changing in conditions. So it might be that productivity has changed, or you need a different excavator to do the work, which is more expensive than the one you price per hour, whatever the case may be. The rule of 3, the third rule, is where the varied work that you're carrying out or being instructed to carry out is not the same character and is not carried out in the same conditions. So this is where you've got a variation or instruction to carry out work that's completely different to work that you've priced under the contract, in which case the entitlement under rules 1, 2 and 3, the standard entitlement, and if the contract is silent on this, you're entitled to fair valuation. When we say fair valuation, effectively it's an assessment, and it can be prospective if the parties agree, or it can be retrospective, or of the reasonable direct cost actually incurred plus reasonable profit. Okay, so if there are no rates suitable for application or adjustment, it's reasonable cost plus profit. Now, the FIDIC Red Book 1999 version does deal with this in clause 12.3. It doesn't quite read in the same way as rules 1, 2 and 3, but if you interrogate clause 12.3 of the FIDIC Red, what you find is that it ticks that box of rules 1, 2 and 3, because what it says is that If the work is basically the same or a rate is appropriate, then you apply that rate for varied works. If you look under that the second of the sub bullet under the third bullet, it says the work is instructed under clause 13. So if it's a variation and no rate or price is specified in the contract for this item, and no specified rate or price is appropriate because the item of work is not of similar character or executed on similar conditions as any item of the contract, in which case you can develop a new rate. You then have to read the last bit of 12.3, which says if there are no contractual rates that are suitable for the derivation of a new rate, then you come up with a new rate which is based on reasonable cost plus profit. So what that last bullet point says, by extension and reading round, is that if you've got a rate that's suitable for adjustment for this varied work, then you apply that and you can use that and utilize that. So that's rule 2 out of rules 1, 2 and 3. There's a further provision under the Red Book, and this is quite common in civil engineering contracts, whereby the contractor may have an entitlement to claim an adjustment in price based on a change in quantities. There are various provisions to these clauses. Contractors often think they're a bit of a way out to correct an underpriced item perhaps, or perhaps a keenly priced item in their bill. But the thing you've got to be mindful of this kind of clause, and it does expressly set it out in the FIDIC contract, is that you're only entitled to a variation for a change in quantity in those circumstances, i.e. increase in quantity, if the change in quantity itself has changed the unit price of the material, of doing the work. Okay, so what that means is that if in doing twice as much of a certain kind of material, let's say for example it's a blended rate, which is an example that I've been working on very recently, we had two kinds of work that were blended together into one contract rate. And of course, that contract rate then is fine on the basis that the proportions of the two works are the same all the way through. One of the quantities of the work changed, and what that did is it knocked the balance of the proportions of work, which meant, in essence, that the cost of doing that work per queue actually went up as a result of the changing quantities. So that's the sort of situation where you may have an entitlement to change, but there's quite a lot of work that needs to go in to identify the basis of that. So extensions of the time for delay, very topical issue given the current situations that are happening at the moment. As you understand, we're talking to an awful lot of people about extensions and entitlements under the FIDIC and or otherwise. Clause 8.4 of the FIDIC Red Book deals with entitlement to extension of time per se, and it sets out that the contractor is entitled to an extension of time in principle in relation to variations or a substantial change in quantity, similar to as we've just discussed. Expressly stated in a subclause of the conditions. So if there is a, say for example, clause 2.1, which is the employer gives access to and use of the site, and in the event that such access and use of is not given, then that entitles the contractor to an extension of time. So that's stated in clause 2.1, which then links to 8.4, which is your entitlement. Exceptionally adverse climatic conditions. We're not going to get into the details of that right now. This is an interesting one, shortage of labour or goods by epidemic or government actions, which I think is rather pertinent to what has been happening recently and is potentially an avenue, certainly for an extension of time for contractors in respect of the effects of COVID. And delays by employer, his personnel or other contractors, that's effectively a prevention kind of argument. So where the employer's actions or inactions or an agent of theirs has stopped the contractor doing work, then potentially there's an entitlement to extension of time. Just looking at a few more clauses within FIDIC that deal with time. So we've got clause 8.5 that specifically deals with time in the event of delay by authorities. So here we have a situation where I think it would quite possibly be reasonable, depending on the jurisdiction and the specifics of any any project or case, by looking at what the authorities have implemented, instructed in respect of social distancing, in respect of the ability to have a mobile workforce, for example, which then therefore might route back into entitlement to extension of time in respect of what we're seeing related to COVID. 13.7 deals with changes in legislation. Now, the 1999 version just talks about a change in law, which is quite strict. It talks about law, statute, regulations, that sort of thing, which depending on where you are, depending on where your jurisdiction is, some decrees by governments may be determined to be a change in law or a change in statute or a change in regulations, but in other jurisdictions they probably won't be. They won't go so far as to be an actual change in law. Now, interestingly, the 2017 version broadened the scope of the change in legislation clause to include decrees, rules and orders. Now, in my opinion, this is much more open to the ability to bring in the COVID kind of restrictions that we've seen governments enforce on construction sites, movement of labour, moving people, social distancing, that sort of thing, is much more likely to be encompassed underneath that broad banner. But of course, there are nuances on every case, every project, every issue that always need to be reviewed accordingly. And force majeure, the famous force majeure. I'm sure a lot of you have been looking at the force majeure clauses to see if you've got a force majeure clause and take advice on that issue. Of course, you'd understand there's an awful lot of discussion on this at the moment. It's amended entitled to exceptional circumstances in 2017 and entitles you to time and no cost if it's not one of the specific listed events in the FIDIC contract, FIDIC 1999 contract. But we have this test force majeure, so it has to be an unforeseeable event. Well, okay, yeah, fair enough. It has to be not due to one of the parties. It has to be beyond the party's control. But there's the final issue of it has to be able to be overcome or not able to be overcome for it to be force majeure. And I think, again, depending on different project circumstances, might determine differently as to whether or not parties see that the effects of COVID could have been overcome or not. But that's a whole other discussion that we can have at length later on if you wish. So, delay analysis. So we talked very briefly touched on where you may have an entitlement to extension of time, but what always needs to be remembered and what sometimes gets overlooked a little, to be frank, is the understanding of causation and the connection of causation with effect. Okay, so it's very easy to work backwards and say, well, we're in delay and this has happened, and then try and link it to something that's happened earlier on. But it's vitally important that anyone putting in a claim for an extension of time has to identify and particularize the causation, but then has to specifically demonstrate the effect of that causation on their progress, on the completion of the works. And the best way to do that, the only real way to do that, is by doing some form of critical path analysis. So generally, certainly in common law and worldwide in general principle, the use of the utilization of a critical path assessment method is well established, well understood in principle. Obviously, there's lots of detail, but well understood in that you have to understand where the critical path is on the project, and the effect on the critical path, in simplistic terms, is the effect on where the contractor is going to finish. Notably, as I mentioned before, the 2017 version of the FIDIC has become much more procedurally driven, much more project management driven than the last version, and it brings out more detail about what's required in respect of the programme, not just developing a programme, but updating a programme, and the fact that the critical path has to be clearly identified and the programme has to be updated on a regular basis. So this is all a way of both managing projects, but also understanding and being able to deal with causations and delay effects in the future. What's interesting, I mean, there are various methods that we can use for delay analysis, all set out in the Society of Construction Law Protocol and also the AACE guidance in respect of delay, and all sorts of other literature out there, and we're certainly not going to go into that now. But there seems to be a bit of a movement by the courts at the moment to not be so religious at just sticking to, well, this is the methodology that is best and this gives a result. Courts seem to be moving a little bit more to a touch more of a pragmatic approach to looking at, okay, using a methodology to understand the delay, but then looking in the wider sense of, you know, other factors, other issues, looking at the reality of where the parties actually were at any one point. So what we're finding is that we're taking one of the standardized delay analysis methods, finding the best one to fit to a contractor's needs, but then tweaking that and hybriding that to get the best, the most appropriate picture of the reality of the situation, because generally that's what tribunals want to see. They want to see the reality of the situation, and that's a very difficult thing to identify. But the best general form of analysis at the moment is to undertake a windows analysis. Very briefly, what that does is it takes a critical path program, that can be utilised, that can be impacted and changed around. It needs to be updated on a monthly basis with the actual progress, and then each window, which is very, so let's say each month period or each 3 months period or each week period, whatever the project needs, the critical path is reassessed. It's impacted, it's reassessed, because the point about a critical path is that it moves all the way through the contract. It's very rare that it stays the same from the day one through to completion. So it's very important that the change and the weft and weave of the critical path and the progress of the parties is suitably picked up as the project moves. As I said, there's an awful lot we could talk about that. So generally, FIDIC contracts are, and this is for claims, but also in respect of variations for reasonable cost, are cost-based. And it defines cost. I mean, for example, clause 1.9 is an example. It says if the contractor suffers delay and or incurs cost, capital C, cost. If it's a capitalized word, it's defined in the contract. And the definition of cost under FIDIC is any expenditure incurred or to be incurred on-site or off-site, including overheads. Okay, so when we talk about cost, we're talking about actual expenditure that the contractor has made or is going to make as a result of what's happened. So, I mean, in assessing a claim for cost, you have to take into account whether it's been expended, whether it's going to be expended. So you've got to look at things like discounts and credits that you might get from your suppliers, rebates. So, an invoice cost doesn't necessarily mean that's the overall cost that a contractor has actually incurred, because they might have given a rebate under another guise for something else in relation to that project. Looking at settlements and what have you. So it's actual cost incurred by the contractor. You have to identify whether the sum claimed or expended was specifically linked to the reason alleged. So this is the link between causation and effect. Very, very important that you get that clearly set out. And you also have to confirm that the expenditure was reasonable. So you can't just go out and spend loads of money on fixing something or say, oh, something's happened, so we're just going to pile the cost of it. It has to be reasonably incurred to the magnitude and scale of the issue that is foreseen. And if you're able to mitigate your costs as a contractor, if you're able to mitigate your costs as a contractor, then you have a general obligation to do so. So typical causes of additional costs, some are under the contract, some are not. So we've talked about prolongation, late information or the design team, changes to the specification, late free issue materials, lost productivity, so working in the winter, say, for example, suspension due to late payment. There is a whole list, a whole raft of issues that could entitle a contractor to cost. But what did CRUX find? So I'll pass over to Dave, who will now take you through our CRUX analysis in this respect.
Thanks very much, Charles. So as referred to this CRUX report earlier, it is the one major piece of thought leadership that we publish every year. The first one we did was in 2018, which looked at digitalization. This one, 2019, which was issued, is looking at causes of dispute and also in an overview of the various sectors. We'll look at that in a minute. Also, just for your information, the next report, which will be issued hopefully later in 2020, will explore how dispute causation varies by geographical region and also form of contract. So that's something to keep a weather eye out for going forward. Just see if I can move this slide down. Okay, so look at the background to the CRUX report. Some of this I mentioned earlier. I think just a couple of things to reinforce is that the entirety of the results in this report have come from HKA commissions. So those 700 projects, all major projects internationally, were actual projects that we worked on. And so the information has been published into 6 sectors, which we can look at now. Those sectors which are in the 2019 report. Firstly, buildings, was 232 projects, average value of 419 million. Then not so many, but defence, aerospace and military, often enormous projects, and you can see there are 14 projects with an average cost of 9.8 billion, so quite incredible size projects. Industrial projects, 57 of them, with an average value of 1.4 billion. Infrastructure, 131 projects, average value $1.6 billion. Then oil and gas, again, these are rather major schemes, some of these very large LNG projects around the world that we've been quite involved with. 114 projects, though, an average value of 5.3 billion. Power and utilities, 100 projects with an average of 791 million, although sprinkled amongst that there are some quite large mega projects which we have been involved with on power, where they've put together various plants in parallel to supply power in quite an emergent situation in certain countries. Going forward, this will move. So the causes of dispute that were discovered in the report findings. You can see there, and we're not going to go through this in great detail individually, or we'll struggle to get to the end of this webinar. But you can see change in scope is at the top as the biggest primary cause of dispute in building projects, with contract requirements behind it, with half as many of the primary causes of delay. It was interesting. Really, change of scope is an employer or client issue where they have failed to adequately consider the scope of the project at the outset in the design phase. Contract requirements being poorly drafted, well, again, that's really with the employer or client's advisors. Sometimes opportunistic in their approach, trying to be maybe a bit too clever and putting pressure and strain on the contract and the supply chain going forward. Late design information is with the designer. Also, incomplete design is with the designer, and where designer work is incorrect is with the designer. Issues for contractors, though, poor management of the supply chain and the level of skills and experience. So the causes of dispute in buildings is sprinkled amongst the employer, the designer, and also the contractor. So just drawing for the causes in a summary way of those buildings that were analysed, with significant changes in scope, maybe being reduced if there'd been more upfront design work that had been undertaken. Multiple effects of failing to manage design and changes in scope really causes these disputes to cascade right through the programme. The perceived urgency to deliver is perhaps leading to an overuse of design, build, contracts, and maybe it's a lazy way forward. And there tends to be a poor definition of the employer's requirements within these design build contracts. And we've seen particularly in the UK actually with PFI and PPP projects. I'd say negligence and opportunism contribute to some poor drafting, which I mentioned earlier, of the contract requirements by the client advisors. And procurement teams need to be very careful when they are amending these standard form contracts where they seek to employ basically the employer's position. I do think a couple of other points just worth mentioning is that when contractors are chasing work in new areas, perhaps in areas like the East and Asia, the balance of power often shifts to the employer or the client, particularly ground condition clauses suddenly in those parts of the world don't appear. So if there's adverse physical conditions, contractors don't have an opportunity to claim through an express term in the contract. And also sometimes they're faced with onerous performance security provisions for these contracts. So there's things to watch out for. Moving to the next sector is defence, military and aerospace projects. Again, not so many analysed, but they were, as we remember from before, very large projects, over 9 billion in average. It's interesting there, it's the one time where change in scope isn't the biggest cause. So contract requirements were poorly drafted was the biggest primary cause of delay and disruption leading to disputes. Change in scope, however, was second. Design being incomplete, operational performance issues, and design being incorrect. You can see when you look down the list there, mainly the fault of the employer and designer. And there's certain specialities about these projects. They are slightly different in nature to the average building or infrastructure project. The fast-moving evolution of technology in these, particularly in respect of defence contracts, makes it harder to predict and manage changes in scope. Combine that with the incomplete design, that domino effect leads to delays and spiralling costs. We've seen quite some incredible spend on these projects. And perhaps when the contracts were originally drafted, didn't contemplate the inevitability of major scope change, given the fact that the nature of military and defence projects is that it's likely to be driven by that fast-moving evolution in technology, which is inevitably going to lead to major scope changes. So the contracts really need to perhaps take on board that inevitability. I think all parts of the supply chain from many, many different locations around the world, particularly in the aerospace sector, need to have a united understanding of the objectives which have to be delivered. And maybe that final point there is a need for business collaboration along the lines of ISO 44001 may help to produce a more seamless supply chain, because when bits of kit are coming from so many different parts of the world and on short periods where there's scope changes, people having to design things very quickly, relying also on many, many other subcontractors and suppliers within that chain to come up with the design. I think that business collaboration would be a good way forward. Okay, moving to the next sector, which is industrial. So industrial sector, again, back at the top is change in scope, with 25 of the primary causes of disputes in that sector. I do think it's important to note there the third one, which is level of skill and or experience, which features quite high in this sector. And also poor management of subcontractors and suppliers and their interfaces. So that's something in this sector worth noting. Let's get this slide to move. Review of industrial causes. The very fast-track contracts often end before the design is sufficiently developed. It's the nature of industrial projects. Decision to invest is made, and there's an urgency to get the project onto site quickly, and that can lead often to an awful lot of scope change. There's pinch points, compromises when long-standing assets, from whether it's train sheds to factories are upgraded to house new and more sophisticated systems and equipment. Ideally, those employers should be designing facilities from the inside out to align the building design and processes, but often it isn't the case. They're taking an existing structure and trying to put inside it a very sophisticated system, which then causes some problems. I think, you mentioned just before, compounding the problems in this sector, we found is the lack of skilled and experienced workers, particularly in the growing economies and other territories where industrial markets are overheating. A very, very sensitive mouse. Causes of dispute in infrastructure. Again, it's a bit of a same old story, but top of the house again is change in scope, 59 of the primary causes. Contract requirements poorly drafted. I've seen this on many, many occasions on major infrastructure projects. Also, access to site and workplace can be restricted or late. And when there are restrictions in getting access to particular areas, it's quite amazing how disruptive that is and the effect on the productivity. Very, very much a point not to be underestimated. And obviously in infrastructure, it's not surprising to see physical conditions that were unforeseen being quite highly rated in the list there. So, as we mentioned, change in scope was again very much at the top of the list. Why? Well, employers going to market perhaps too early with inflexible delivery models. Teams cannot anticipate all changes at the outset, so maybe there should be some more flexibility. That's what we think to be built in to cope with the perhaps multiple number of stakeholders that infrastructure investments typically serve. And the genesis of disputes on these large public sector projects lie with the client. The multi-tiered structures of public bodies often complicate decision making and make for very onerous procedures from an administration point of view. So just a little note at the bottom, just as a little example, bundling of different skill sets into single elements of an asset's design by the client to project failure. As an example, if rail systems are combined with civil engineering, the civils partner will take the lead, probably due to the relative financial value of the size of their contract, albeit the rail systems are critical. The rail systems company needs to have a voice really at the table with the client at an early stage to ensure that the civils design considers the system's requirements. And all too often, we've seen many examples of that where there's complicated signalling issues, rail systems mixed in with civils procedures and metro schemes and the like, and really, you know, it does need a much more holistic, high-level view to be taken. Okay, the next sector is oil and gas, an area where I've had quite a lot of experience over the years, and it doesn't surprise me at all that change in scope is there, again, at the top of the list. The highly cyclical industry, which we all know it is, with its troughs and peaks in supply and demand, tend to shape the behaviour of those owners, contractors, the fabricators, the whole supply chain. I mean, historically, when we go back, the oil and gas majors completed the design and procurement in-house, issued equipment free issue, and tendered packages out for the installation side of work. But now, again, transferring the risk down to the contractor, we're seeing a lot of heavily amended EPC, engineering construct contracts, scope-related risks are passed down to the contractors and supply chains sometimes regardless of their ability effectively to manage those risks. I think also perhaps it's an area, oil and gas, which is perhaps seen as a more kind of old-fashioned dirty area of the business. Perhaps the younger people aren't so keen to work in oil and gas due to climate issues and the like, and we've seen that the workforce, which is largely experienced in the 50s and 60s, there is a skills crisis as those people pass into retirement. So we think that the skills shortage in this sector is also an issue causing a number of the disputes. The opportunistic size of the claims on the mega projects, and this is no exaggeration, lies by a factor of 5. So that gives rise to disputes, and when the claims are so overstated, it's very difficult to get to negotiated settlements when contractors are digging their heels in with such overstated claims. Technology development is causing major delays as projects become more complex. What we have seen is that there has been, by the oil majors, a bit of an uptake and an interest in engaging us to work with their design teams at a very, very early stage in trying to scope the employer requirements, etc. Is what they call wargaming, which is basically looking at where those projects could go wrong, where could the disputes arise on those projects, very, very early stage in the investment process. And that seems to be gaining popularity with clients, and certainly from my perspective, I think it's been very successful and well received. Okay, the next sector is power and utilities. And here we see contract requirements poorly drafted, with 42 primary and 26 secondary, just nudges ahead of changes in scope. But again, we see number 4 cause their level of skill and or experience. Now, we've seen many disputes where prime contractors here have taken on excessive risk and not really understood ramifications. We've also come across issues where projects are being split into separate contracts to be entered directly by contractors and the clients on the same overall project, which leads to massive complications of interfaces. Design information, often from the urgency of owners to start construction really before fundamental design is complete, and that can often be a likely consequence of public funding and political pressures that can dominate this sector, and also where there's an urgent need for electricity within a country, then sometimes they go to market far too quickly. I think it's notable when we've seen the return to nuclear, or people trying to return to nuclear, should I say, in these last few years. There's a real lack of specialist nuclear engineers, because really in the last 20 years there hasn't been that many projects that have been undertaken, and those that have been undertaken, I'm sure those of you that have worked in those sectors will know some of the headline disastrous cases come out of that sector, particularly the nuclear sector. Now also perhaps a simmering build-up of operational performance problems arising in the wind power sector. We've seen some interesting cases early on there, but I think going forward we're going to see the operational side, because they're tied into some quite big operational performance provisions, which I think, as these lengthy contracts unwind, may lead to further disputes. So, conclusions that we can draw before I hand back to Charles. From this 2019 report, lacks control of scope and design. Well, that's all in the hands, really, of the client and his design team, or the client and their advisors when scoping employers' requirements. Sometimes a completely unrealistic set of requirements are put down for contractors to try and comply with. And skill gaps, spurious claims are prevalent within the web of interrelated causation factors. So perhaps if there was a better balanced allocation of risk, but we've all been saying this for so many years, nothing really seems to change, would lead to a more collaborative approach to contracting. There still seems to be the entrenched client side, contractor side, and slugging it out in disputes, which hasn't much changed in the 34 years that I've been working in this company. I think probably the biggest change has been the move towards design build and EPC contracts, but that's just dumping the further risk down on the contractors and hoping for the best. But at the end of the day, it's the client that needs the project. So I do think that if they spent the time, money up front, it would be helpful, not only for the contractor, but for them. They would have less disputes. Complexity, no doubt, will continue to be underestimated. On many projects, disputes and disruption could be limited, maybe not completely preempted, but if there was expert and impartial engineering audits that were carried out to ensure that the designs were robust at an early stage, and that then will lead to this great number of variations, change in scope, all of which I've said earlier, just cascades through the programme and causes that ongoing delay in and, as Charles will talk about, acceleration measures to try and pull back those delays that are hitting the project. So that really is all I wanted to talk to you about in terms of CRUX. It's a very, very lengthy document, and it's interesting for you to get a hold of that, and particularly have a look at those sector reports where you're working with clients and contractors. So I'd invite you to take a look at that. And now I'll hand you over to Charles, who will take this through to the end. If this moves, yes, there we are. So go to Charles.
Thank you, Dave. Very insightful stuff. It really is a good read, the CRUX reports. And as Dave says, we're doing more and more deep dive analysis on that as each week goes by. So some very interesting stuff we're getting from there. Conscious that time is whizzing on, so I am reasonably swiftly going to briefly touch on overhead costs, prolongation costs. We're going to touch a bit on disruption, and we're going to finish off with a quick discussion about acceleration and what constructive acceleration means. So prolongation costs, well, there are all sorts of costs that a contractor might incur in respect of a delay to their project. So that might be a shutdown due to COVID, or indeed just an increased period of time on site due to that, or indeed any other causation for which they're entitled to. So you might have site staff that you're paying for, retention of materials, equipment on site, scaffolding that's been put up, for example, that you're having to hire for a longer period, other services that you have to include. So to service the site cabins and offices, there'll be a cost associated with that, rental of equipment, rental of cars, utilities and telephones, insurance premiums, because very often project insurances will be based on a certain period or a certain contract. If that gets extended, the contractor needs to ensure that their insurance premiums are included or extended to cover the period. Head office overheads, we're going to briefly talk about what that means and how you can assess that. Financing charges, which is often up for debate, we'll briefly touch on that. Loss of profit, I'll put that loss of profit with a question mark. That's obviously something we can look at and is obviously a hot topic. Generally, when we're looking at FIDIC conditions, we're entitlement to cost. We talked about that briefly before, which is expenditure incurred or to be incurred. So generally that won't cover main contractor's profit per se, but you can have a situation where the main contractor might be obliged to pay a subcontractor their profit under their agreement, in which case that's an out-of-pocket cost that the main contractor is incurring. So there's potentially a loss of profit claim that the contractor can roll up the line if indeed they've got entitlement to do so. So site overheads. Well, site overheads are effectively time-related resources for staff and equipment materials that are based on site. So relatively simple. I'm not going to go into this in great detail because of the time, but it's things like, you know, the prolongation of project management staff, supervision staff, engineering staff potentially on site, and all the equipment ancillaries, maybe rental of accommodation for those staff, travelling to and from site for those staff. You know, they might be on a rotation or a weekly basis, or indeed just their daily mileage, if indeed they're entitled to that. Security, cleaners, all these kind of aspects which are site overheads, which relate specifically to the length of time that the project or the site is open or there in existence. Delay claims for plant, again, this is something that often is a bit of a head scratcher for contractors, because what the courts have found, and this is generally the case worldwide, is that you're not entitled to higher rates if the plant is owned by the claiming company. And where this gets a bit difficult is that very often you have big group companies, big group contractor, who will have a plant supply arm, and internally they charge internal higher rates for the provision of, you know, whatever equipment it is that they're charging out. So as far as the project's concerned, they look at that as a cost. But depending on the structure of the company, it might be that actually it's not that internal charge rate isn't a cost for the business per se, in which case, and if you are in a situation where you have internal movement of equipment, materials and internal hire rates, then you have to look at the depreciation and maintenance costs. So in other words, what you've got to look at is, well, when the company bought that piece of equipment, it's going to depreciate over a certain amount of period, so it will have a cost that has got to that point, and then there's an annual or regular maintenance and upkeep requirement that the company will be incurring as a cost that has been extended as a result of the longer use of that piece of equipment on site. And as you can imagine, it's a very difficult thing to identify. It's a very difficult thing to put your finger on, and lots of discussions, let's say, can be had over the level rate of depreciation, because there's the theoretical applied depreciation, the actual depreciation, there's all these bits and pieces go with it. So it can be incredibly complex, and the simplest way to do is to use internal charge rates, but that's only potentially if the parties agree. So head office costs. So when we say head office costs, we talk about off-site costs. So in essence, and this is covered by the FIDIC form, so for example, that talks about cost being on-site or off-site. So that includes your head office costs, because again, the courts and generally the industry recognises that aspects of your head office function go towards making that project function. And if the project is on site for longer, and there's a cause for entitlement to an extension of time and cost for that, then it follows that the contractor is actually incurring a bit more of that head office cost as a result of that prolongation on site. But as you can imagine, it's a very difficult thing to quantify. There is, you know, head office costs. Well, there's a list there of the sort of things it covers, but it's things like ground rent, it's things like, you know, maybe design staff or purchasing, or, you know, your CEO as a cost, you know, turning the lights on in the head office, travel, transport, all these bits and pieces that go around that. In the general way to look at head office costs are to split them into two types of tranche. And this was identified under Tate and Lyle, which is a very famous case in the UK, and various others, which says, well, of the head office resource, some of that resource, it's reasonable for them to be able to identify the time that they've spent as a result of you know, dealing with this issue or on site longer. So, for example, a commercial manager who's not 100% directed to that project. It's not a project cost, say, it's a head office cost, but he or she can say, well, I know I've spent, and this is from my diaries, my records, a day a week dealing with this issue or covering for this as a result of the delay. So some aspects of head office costs can be carved out if it's identifiable. So very often you'll have engineering costs. You might have an engineering department who book their time to a specific project code. And in that case, you can then carve that out, identify that aspect of cost that relates to the project, and jobs are good. But there's a whole lot of other costs. So, you know, the CEO and the secretary and the, you know, all the bits and pieces about running the head office cost that can't be specifically allocated. And again, it's been recognised in the courts that that just can't happen. You know, realistically, no one keeps those kind of records. It doesn't make any sense to do so. There are several formulas, well-known established formulas, the best one probably being the Emden formula, which effectively looks at the contribution or the assessed contribution that the project would have made to the company divided by the head office costs, and then that just basically calculates a factor, a percentage factor that is applied to the extended duration of the contract and applied to the head office percentage recovery that is pre-assessed. So it's an assessment. It's an average, but generally it's recognised as the most appropriate way of recouping or representing, let's say, the head office cost that has actually been incurred as a result of a delay. Financing costs is an acceptable head of claim. So when we say financing costs, what we mean is if the contractor has, obviously, if a project is delayed, then the contractor has to finance that. They have to pay for that. They have to pay for the staff to be there, for the equipment to be there for a longer period. And that money ultimately doesn't come from payments for measured work. It comes from the claim. So effectively, that's a financing that the company, the contractor, has to do on a temporary basis. And there will be charges that the contractor incurs. So if they're taking, you know, if they have a loan arrangement with a lender and that part of that goes towards financing that period of delay, then there's a financing charge interest that the contractor will be paying on that amount that they're entitled to recover as their financing charges. I'll go into that in great detail. Inflation costs or price fluctuation costs. So even if you've got a fixed price contract, the prices, the contractor will have taken on board the risk of fluctuation for a certain contract period, but it's quite possible if you have a significant delay and that pushes the period into, let's say, I don't know, quite topical, a drastically different oil price, then it's quite possible that the contractor's rates and prices for the future work when they actually recommence work aren't appropriate, and in no way could have been considered in the contractor's risk profile because they didn't expect to be doing this work next year. They expected it to be doing last year, and that's what they've hedged their risk on. But of course, the issue with that is it's possible for a positive and negative effect on that, so that's something to be looked at. Loss of profit, well, let's not talk about that right now. So disruption claims, well, this is incredibly topical. So for those of you who are still with us, thank you very much for that. This is probably the most, or certainly one of the largest kind of heads of claim that contractors are going to be interested in, especially with the current COVID-19 situation, because disruption is where you might have a delay or stoppage of certain aspects of work, or certain aspects of work take longer, but it doesn't necessarily impact the overall completion of the project. But it might be that the work is being carried out less productively, that you're bringing in additional resource, that you're having to stack shifts, or that you're working in a way, or a contractor's working in a way that just increases their cost for whatever reason. So, for example, you know, if contractors working on site having to socially distance, then it might well be that there are certain things that take, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, 50% longer than they would have done if the people on site would be able to work very much close to each other, or without having to continually go and wash hands or continually go and follow some kind of health and safety procedure as a result of the ongoing situation. So in effect, what it is that if due to a causation, it takes the contractor a longer time, or they have to incorporate more resources to do the work over a period, then that is in essence a disruption claim. Now, disruption claims are notoriously difficult to pursue, and in my opinion and my experience, the vast majority of disruption cases that don't do very well do so on the basis of having poor records. Records really are the item that underpin any disruption claim, okay? And it's not just accurate records. Noted here, you need accurate records, and absolutely you do. You need accurate and detailed records. You can have something that's accurate at a very high level, but what we need for disruption claims is both accuracy and an awful lot of detail, because what you've got to be able to do is identify what the people were doing, the resource were doing, and why they were doing it in that specific way. And you need to be able to carve out and allocate as appropriate different aspects of work according to different areas, insofar that those different areas are affected. And it might be that you're looking site-wide, in which case it makes it a lot simpler. But even so, accurate and detailed records are the absolute be-all and end-all with a disruption claim. Because if you don't have that, then that's going to be a big, big problem and a big, big hurdle to get over. So I'll just quickly come back to the measured mile approach. So one way of assessing disruption, and this is probably the most common way that I see, is that a contractor says, well, this is how much it's costing me to do this right now, and this is what I had in my tender, and the difference, therefore, is my disruption claim. So what's the problem? Well, as you can understand, what is in your tender might not be what was realistic, achievable, or what you were actually achieving prior to something happening. So the difference between what's in your tender and what is actually carried out, okay, it might be in respect of the contractor's view internally, the impact on what their cost and their CFR is going to be, but it doesn't necessarily go to identify under a contract what their entitlement is. You're entitled to the effect of the causation. Yeah? So what that means is that you've got to look at what would have happened had the causation not happened. And that's not necessarily, as we'll see, what the tender says, because the tender might have been over-egged, it might have been under-egged, we don't know. The best way of assessing a disruption claim is by using what's called the measured mile approach. It's very simple in its basis and in its description. It can be very difficult in application, but effectively what it says is you take two bits of work that are ostensibly the same kinds of work, and you look at what the contractor actually managed to achieve in the period without the effect, and then you look at what the contractor actually, that is the measured mile, like the baseline, and then you look at what the contractor actually achieved after the effect, and you compare the two, and the difference, in very simplistic terms, is the claimable amount. Now, of course, when we're looking at something like COVID and the current situation, then actually there might be a whole wealth of information there to say, well, look, this is how we were this is how we were working pre-COVID, and this is how we're looking after COVID. And of course, the good thing, certainly for all parties and for getting agreement, the good thing about the measured mile approach is that it takes into account either any overachievement that the contractor's carrying out, because again, it doesn't have to be pegged at the tender. If the contractor's actually overachieving on what they originally planned, then that's the difference. So you get a double gain as a contractor in theory. But of course, from an employer's point of view, what it also does, if the contractor is already having their own troubles pre-COVID or pre-causation, then that will show up on the measured. So the measured mile clearly shows the differentiation of effects just due to that specific causation. And that's the important thing to pull out. And that's why it's so important. But you can understand why accurate and detailed records are so critically important for the assessment of that. So this is just an example of where the measured mile has been approached and upheld by the courts. We won't go into that. So we're very briefly going to touch, I appreciate I'm over time now, so I do apologise for that. Very, very briefly touch on acceleration, because again, that's something that's quite pertinent at the moment. So acceleration is where a contractor is providing resources or in some way expediting works to finish earlier than they would have otherwise have finished. Okay, so it might be acceleration to achieve a completion date, or it might just be an acceleration to bring the works forward because the employer wants to. Now, generally, contracts don't have express requirements or entitlements for the employer to unilaterally instruct to instruct an acceleration by the contractor, i.e. to bring the completion before the planned completion date. Okay, there's very often a provision where the parties can agree that the employer can ask the contractor to provide a quotation to accelerate. So in other words, to say, well, here's your completion date. How much is it going to cost you to finish a month early, or how much is it going to cost me to finish a month early? And obviously the parties agree to do that. Now, what many contracts do have is a requirement that if the contractor, due to their own fault, is due to complete after the completion date, so in other words, if they've got a delay to the contract but they're not entitled to an extension of time, then many contracts put an obligation upon the contractor to come up with ways and means to implement an acceleration measure to bring forward to make sure they do complete on time. So that's something to bear in mind. But what we also have is the issue of what's called constructive acceleration. So constructive acceleration is a situation whereby the contractor, it's clear that the contractor is going to complete after the planned completion date. The employer insists that the contractor finishes on or before the completion date. But the thing is, in a construction acceleration case, the contractor is actually entitled to an extension of time, which covers the period that they're going to overrun, but they've not been awarded it. So if the employer refuses to issue an extension of time that the contractor is entitled to, and the contractor then implements measures, incurs costs, brings in additional resources, shifts, equipment, expedites material delivery, changes design, whatever the case may be, changes the sequence of work, puts all this effort in to completing on the completion date, but it subsequently turns out that they were entitled to an extension of time, then that would be a position of constructive acceleration, and the contractor will be entitled to a claim for costs in that respect. And that's what we saw in Motherwell Bridge versus Mickerfield, which is exactly that situation. The parties entered into a contract. I won't go into the nuances of it, but in the end, the judge determined that in essence, they were contracting on the FIDIC form of contract, the FIDIC reg form of contract. And the judge also held that the contractor should have been entitled to an extension of time under that form of contract, which was not given, but Motherwell Bridge accelerated to complete on the original completion date, and they were therefore entitled to their acceleration costs. Again, it's absolutely key to be able to identify, clearly particularize, and pull out with a great degree of accuracy and detail what those acceleration measures were, that they were effective, because you've got to also show that you implemented the acceleration measures, demonstrate the cost and resource of those. They weren't just brought on for your own means, but also show that they're effective, because it has to be cost reasonably incurred. You know, if you come back to FIDIC, you can't just throw stuff at it if it's not reasonably incurring a cost, which doesn't actually have any net effect on accelerating themselves. So lots of nuance, lots of things to talk about, but that gives you a very quick run through of some of the key issues that need to be looked at in this respect. So on that note, I'll pass back to Dave to sign off. I'm not sure what we're doing with questions, Suzanne, but thanks very much.
We do have a few questions that have come in. We've just got 3, so I don't know if you want to try and address those quickly now on the session, if I can read them out to you. First one is, sorry, David.
I didn't say anything.
The first one is from Anton Leidinger. I'm just going to unmute Anton if he's still on the line in case he wants to join the discussion. But Anton's question was regarding loss of productivity costs. Which method of establishing these costs would you recommend?
I think Charles addressed that with his measured mile approach, and I think, Charles, perhaps if you just want to quickly sum that up again.
Yeah, absolutely. Loss of productivity, you know, the gold standard, the kind of Rolls Royce of a loss of productivity job is the measured mile, whereby you've got to look at the equivalent types of work. So, you know, if you're looking at an overall project, then you can basically look at the project pre and the project after. But if you're looking at the issue on a specific building, for example, so let's say, for example, you're putting up 2 buildings next to each other, and you've got issues with the steel frame on building 2, in that there are design changes and there's a lot more detail, there's a lot more secondary steel, for example. So you're thinking, well, actually, you know, this isn't right, it's taking us a lot longer, we're having to get people up there rather than mute, or whatever the case may be. What you do is you have the records of building 1, and you say, well, this is what we should have done, this is what we based our price on, this is what we're entitled to. But now we've got the records of building 2, which is massively more complex. We can't go into every single little detail that's changed, but we can demonstrate empirically that this is taking us 1.5 times longer per man day to carry out. And that is a way to assess those costs. Now, where your problem lies, and where the problem often lies, it's all well and good saying, oh, I'll just use the measured mile, that's great. But sometimes it's very difficult to understand whether you can even identify a measured mile. And if you're in a situation where you don't have that, you know, it might be that you've been disrupted from day 1, for example. There's nothing to say that a disruption doesn't happen, you know, straight away as soon as you get on site. in which case you've got to think a lot harder and a lot outside the box, or look at, find previous projects that you've worked on, for example, or previous examples under previous contracts, as similar as possible as you can. So let's say size and weights of steel, taking that example, and apply that accordingly. So there's no kind of right or wrong. The gold standard is the measured mile, but it's not always that simple. Does that answer your question, Anton?
Move on to the next.
I'm not sure if you can hear me. Yes,
Oh, sorry,
yes, it does answer the question.
Yeah, I did unmute you.
Yep, thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. It's from Luca Puletti. Again, I'll unmute Luca in case he wants to join the discussion. The question was, which is the most acceptable method to prove loss of equipment productivity? Are blue book rates still usable?
Yeah, if you want, hello, I can add a sentence I heard was very clearly explain the way to charge for own equipment. Problem that normally internally you don't have rate or representative rate of the real depreciation, because under tender pressure you may even allocate the equipment free of charge. Then it comes the problem how to demonstrate this cost, which is quite relevant.
When you own the equipment yourself, Luca, you're looking at cost of depreciation and interest, etc. That's where your first port of call would be. I don't know if you want to add to that, Charles.
Yeah, it's always a difficult thing to deal with, frankly, and especially if you've got, let's say, well-utilized equipment that, in respect of your internal terms, you might well have depreciated and now got to a zero book value. It's quite possible that you've done that, and it's a constant issue to deal with. Going forwards, what I would say the best thing to do is to pre-agree. So if you've got bits of kits that are yours, there's a lot of value, and this is for the benefit of all parties, in pre-agreeing effectively what your delay or what your kind of daily cost that you're going to utilise for this kind of claim is going forwards. Obviously, that doesn't help you dealing with things in the background or things that have happened already. Utilisation of blue book rates is a reasonable starting point. You're probably going to have to give some discounts on that. It depends what your negotiating ability is, but ultimately, as Dave says, your entitlement, if there is no other contractual entitlement, is depreciation and maintenance. So you need to kind of see how well your negotiating skills are tied up with that, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, the next question is from Tullio Tomasoni. Again, I'll unmute Tullio in case they want to join the conversation. In case of substantial modification of quantities into the bill of quantities, FIDIC Red Book seems to allow only a cost recovery on documentation basis. Which one possibility do we have to promote a reasonable allowance on top of costs proof basis?
So sorry, this is to do with a significant change in quantities, effectively.
Tullio, are you on the line? Do you want to elaborate? Or I'll read the question out. The question as written is, in case of substantial modification of quantities into the bill of quantities, FIDIC Red Book seems to only allow a cost recovery on documentation basis. Which possibility do we have to promote a reasonable allowance on top of costs proof basis?
Well, look, again, it's a claim, and you're entitled to reasonable recovery of the impact of that claim. And the idea in general is that a contractor in this kind of circumstance shouldn't be out of pocket as a result of the increased quantity, but at the same time, it's supposed to be net. The idea is that it's net neutral, so you shouldn't particularly make a windfall from it either. And this is the issue that we see, in that you could have a rate for that material already, whereby the contractor already makes a significant margin, or indeed the contractor for some reason has made a significant loss. Sorts of reasons and factors for why that might be. But the issue of looking at a cost-based assessment, the idea is that actually that gain or that loss for the original quantity should be maintained in the pricing. So, you get, as a contractor, you're able to recover the actual impact of that change of quantity, and no more or no less. So in other words, you're still stuck to the bargain that you had in your tender. So from that respect, there's no basis for anything other than that. However, again, coming to the point I said to Luca, the parties are well within their right to be able to review and come up with a reasonable position in respect of the overall quantities based on a forecast or based on whatever justification you want, but it doesn't necessarily follow that there's a strict entitlement to do so. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Yeah, I think
Okay,
that covers all bases there.
Yeah. One final question, and excuse my pronunciation of this. Cecil Kuyuchak. If the company has multiple ongoing projects, what is the best approach to allocate the head office overhead to a specific project?
Thank you.
Oh, I think with head office overheads, you're looking really, if you're going down the formula basis, which Charles talked about earlier, you'd be looking at the actual overheads incurred in the audited reports of that financial year in which the delays took place that led to additional head office overheads. The alternative approach is just to what we used to call the STEAM method, is just where you look at the actual additional head office costs to a particular project rather than a formula basis. And that requires very, very detailed and accurate recording by often layers of management that don't generally keep very good records themselves. But, they need to be able to come up with diary records of what they were doing that day, whether it be 2 or 3 out of their 9-hour day, some record of what they were doing in connection with the project. I think Charles talked earlier about commercial managers maybe spending a certain part of the day on a particular project. So go down that route and looking at the actual cost on the multiplicity of delayed projects, you've got to know that you've got very good records, I would suggest, across all those projects. Otherwise, you might be better falling back on the formula-based method, which is the evidence approach, which is well respected by the courts and arbitrators. So that would be my initial view. I don't know if you want to add to that, Charles?
Yeah. I mean, that's basically exactly it. Just to kind of put it in context, let's say you've got a construction company and all they do is the construction. They don't have any other bits or groups. The head office just relates to construction of these 5 projects, and they have 5 projects worldwide a year. Okay, and all those projects are the same value. Well, the basis of the Emden formula is basically, well, the head office costs are contributed to evenly by, proportionally, depending on the size of the projects, by those 5 projects, and that is taken from the company records, as Dave said. So the idea is, therefore, the percentage is proportionally split for the recovery that goes into the actual the head office costs, and you should be able to demonstrate what your overall head office costs are, and that is proportionally split between those, say, 5 projects. If that is all you do on a proportional basis, that then weights and then goes into the formula for the prolongation cost. So it's a very kind of generalized way of doing it, but as Dave said, it's the kind of the least worst option, I suppose, unless you've got the detailed records, which I guess you probably don't.
Okay, that's it from questions on the Q&A and the chat streams. So if anybody else has got a question that they want to raise their hand before the end of the session, I can take you off mute. And if not, then we'll just thank you all for dialing in today, and thanks to our speakers for an interesting session.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for attending. Thanks for the questions. Thanks to Suzanne and Charles. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Is it off?